Welcome to Paranormal Northwest, a podcast all about the history and the paranormal of the Pacific Northwest. Join me as I tell stories of this great region, the history, the people who live here, and those who may have never left. Today we are taking another look at a dark part of Pacific Northwest history and a dark part of North American history. We are looking at the Indian boarding schools of the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia. Oftentimes, we look at and remember only the bright, good aspects of history. That only serves to perpetuate injustices and inaccuracies in the truth. This episode may make you uncomfortable, and that's the point. No one should listen to the story and think it was the correct, right, or moral thing to do. We cannot rewrite history, but we can choose how we tell it. Warning, this episode may contain language and depictions that may be disturbing to listeners. The concept and purpose of Indian boarding schools in the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia were rooted in the colonial goal of forcibly assimilating Indigenous children into Euro-American and Euro-Canadian society. Governments and religious organizations believed that Indigenous cultures were inferior and incompatible with settler values. The schools aimed to civilize Indigenous children by removing them from their families and communities, isolating them from their languages, traditions, and spiritual practices. By immersing them in a controlled environment focused on Christianity, English and French language acquisition, and Eurocentric values, the intent was to systemically erase Indigenous identities. Key to this assimilation effort was the suppression of Indigenous languages and cultural practices. In these schools, children were often punished for speaking their native tongues or engaging in traditional ceremonies. The curriculum emphasized vocational training for boys and domestic skills for girls, reflecting the colonizers' views that Indigenous people were only suited to menial labor. This education system was designed not to elevate Indigenous students as equals, but to prepare them for subservient roles in settler society, further reinforcing racial hierarchies. The broader aim of these schools was to undermine Indigenous social structures, particularly the transmission of cultural knowledge between generations. By separating children from their elders, who were the traditional bearers of wisdom and cultural practices, schools effectively disrupted Indigenous community life. In addition to cultural erasure, the schools were often sites of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, causing deep trauma among students and their families. Ultimately, the legacy of these boarding and residential schools has been devastating for Indigenous peoples. Generations of children were disconnected from their heritage, leading to widespread cultural loss and intergenerational trauma. In recent years, efforts such as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada and investigations into burial sites in the United States have begun to acknowledge the profound harm caused by these institutions and support the healing and revitalization of Indigenous cultures. The Indian boarding schools in British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest were strategically located in both urban and rural areas, often far from Indigenous communities, to physically and culturally isolate the children. These schools were established in regions with significant Indigenous populations, reflecting the colonial government's intent to assimilate local tribes. In British Columbia, Indian residential schools were strategically distributed across the province, reflecting both the government's desire to assimilate Indigenous children and the logistical need to gather children from remote Indigenous communities. These schools were often placed either near major population centers or in more remote areas, making it difficult for children to maintain contact with their families and cultures. The isolation of these schools was a deliberate tactic to enhance the process of cultural suppression, with administrators believing that removing children from their home environments would expedite their assimilation into Euro-Canadian society. The Kamloops Indian Residential School, located in Kamloops, was one of the largest and most prominent institutions in the province, with hundreds of children from various Indigenous communities passing through its doors. It operated from 1890 to 1978 under Catholic Church administration. The school gained international attention in 2021 when ground-penetrating radar revealed the presence of unmarked graves, highlighting the tragic legacy of these institutions. The Kamloops School became symbolic of the widespread abuses and deaths that occurred in the residential school system. The St. Mary's Indian Residential School is situated in the Fraser Valley town in the Fraser Valley in the town of Mission. St. Mary's was one of the longest running residential schools in British Columbia. Established in 1863 and operated by the Catholic Church, it was one of the first residential schools in the province. It drew children from Coast Salish and Stolo nations, among others. The school's operation until 1984 made it one of the last to close, and survivors have reported enduring physical, emotional, and cultural abuse throughout its long history. The Cranebrook/St. Eugene's Indian Residential School, located near Cranebrook in southeastern British Columbia. This school served children from the, and I know I'm not going to say this right, I apologize in advance, Kanutsa Nation and other indigenous groups in the region. Operating from 1912 to 1970, St. Eugene's was run by the Catholic Church and was part of a network of residential schools designed to assimilate Indigenous children through religious instruction and vocational training. Like many of the other schools, St. Eugene's enforced strict bans on Indigenous languages and cultural practices. These schools often targeted Indigenous communities with significant populations. The schools were typically run by various Christian denominations, including the Catholic, Anglican, and United Churches, which played a central role in the government's assimilation policy. The partnership between the state and religious organizations allowed for the expansion of residential schools, embedding them deeply into the lives of Indigenous communities across the province. However, the traumatic effects of these institutions continue to reverberate through Indigenous communities, as the loss of language, culture, and connection to family had profound and long-lasting impacts. In the American Pacific Northwest, so just Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, Indian boarding schools were established as part of the broader United States government strategy to assimilate Indigenous children by removing them from their communities. The schools in this region were placed both on reservations and in more distant areas, ensuring that Indigenous children were disconnected from their families, languages, and cultural traditions. This physical and cultural isolation was central to the government's goal of assimilating Indigenous children into Euro-American society. Religious organizations, particularly the Catholic and Protestant churches, played a key role in operating many of these schools. The Tulalip Indian School in Washington State, located on the Tulalip Reservation near Marysville. This school opened in 1905 and was run by the Catholic Church. It primarily served children from local tribes, including the Coast Salish, Snohomish, and Duwamish. The Tulalip School was designed to immerse children in a strict regimen of religious instruction, English language education, and vocational training, discouraging any expression of their Indigenous identity. By placing the school on the reservation but isolating the children within the school grounds, the institution attempted to enforce Euro-American values while still maintaining proximity to the Indigenous populations it sought to change. The Shamawa Indian School in Oregon. Established in 1880 near Salem, Shamawa is one of the oldest continuously operating Indian boarding schools in the United States. Initially called the Forest Grove Indian School before moving to Salem in 1885, it drew students from a wide geographic area, including tribes from Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and even Alaska. Students came from tribes like the Yakima, Nez Perce, and Klamath. Chamawa was symbolic of the federal policy that aimed to Americanize Indigenous children through rigid discipline, vocational training, and the suppression of Indigenous languages. Over the years, the school evolved into one of the larger institutions, with a reputation for educating children from diverse tribal backgrounds in the Pacific Northwest. The Fort Spokane Boarding School in northeastern Washington operated between 1900 and 1914. It served children from tribes in the Columbia Plateau including the Spokane, Colville, and other plateau tribes. The school was built on the site of a former military fort, emphasizing the militarized nature of the boarding school experience, with children subject to strict discipline and routine. Like other schools in the region, Fort Spokane focused on vocational training and religious instruction, systemically separating children from their cultural practices and traditions. The remote location of the school ensured that children had little contact with their families, reinforcing their forced acculturation. These boarding schools in the Pacific Northwest were deliberately placed close to indigenous populations to facilitate the systemic removal of children while being far enough away to minimize the influence of their families and communities. This geographical strategy was crucial for the success of the assimilation policy, as the schools aimed to control nearly every aspect of the children's lives. Students were drawn from various tribes, including the Yakima, Nez Perce, Coast Salish, and others, all of whom had and still do hold strong ties to the region's natural landscape and cultural traditions. The impact of these schools was profound, as they played a central role in the effort to erase indigenous languages, customs, and identities in the Pacific Northwest. The origins of the Indian boarding schools. In the United States, the establishment of Indian boarding schools in the United States was closely tied to broader federal assimilation policies that sought to integrate Indigenous peoples into mainstream Euro American society. The Dawes Act of 1887, also known as the General Allotment Act, played a pivotal role in this process. The act divided collectively held Indigenous land into individual plots, with the aim of encouraging private land ownership and reducing the communal nature of Indigenous societies. By breaking up tribal lands, the Dawes Act aimed to dismantle traditional Indigenous social structures, making Indigenous peoples more dependent on Euro American systems of governance, and economy. However, the act also had a direct impact on education policy, as it reinforced the idea that the survival of Indigenous communities depended on their civilization and cultural assimilation. Indian boarding schools were seen as a critical component of this assimilation process, teaching children Euro American farming techniques, household management, and vocational skills that align with the values promoted by the Dawes Act. One of the most significant models for Indian boarding schools was the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, founded in 1879 by Captain Richard Henry Pratt in Pennsylvania. Carlisle was the first off-reservation boarding school for Indigenous children and became the blueprint for many other schools across the United States. Pratt's philosophy was encapsulated in his famous statement, "Kill the Indian, save the man." This phrase summed up the mission of Carlisle and other boarding schools, to strip Indigenous children of their cultural identity and replace it with Euro-American values, language, and behavior. At Carlisle, children were required to cut their hair, wear European-style clothing, and abandon their native languages and spiritual practices. They were taught academic subjects, but more importantly, they were trained in manual labor and vocational skills, such as farming, carpentry, and sewing, that would prepare them for a subordinate role in settler society. The strict regimentation and military-like discipline at Carlisle set the tone for how other Indian boarding schools were run. The success of Carlisle from the government's perspective led to the replication of its model across the United States, including in the Pacific Northwest. The schools in the Pacific Northwest followed Carlisle's example, focusing on assimilation through education, religious instruction, and vocational training. The Carlisle model emphasized the removal of children from their families and communities, often placing them in schools far from their homes, ensuring they had little contact with their Indigenous culture. This approach of physical and cultural separation was considered essential to the goal of erasing Indigenous identities and integrating students into Euro-American society. In Canada, the Indian residential school system was deeply rooted in the Indian Act of 1876, a key piece of federal legislation that granted the Canadian government extensive control over almost every aspect of Indigenous people's lives. The Indian Act was designed to assimilate Indigenous people into Euro Canadian society, with the ultimate goal of erasing Indigenous cultural identities and integrating Indigenous peoples into the mainstream settler population. One of the Act's provisions was the creation of a system of residential schools, which would be used to educate Indigenous children according to Euro Canadian norms, suppressing their native languages and traditions and convert them to Christianity. The residential schools became a central tool for the Canadian government's broader assimilationist policies as they targeted children, the next generation of Indigenous leaders, to sever their connections to their culture and communities. By the late 19th century, attendance at these schools was compulsory for Indigenous children in many regions of Canada, further cementing their role in the forced assimilation process. A significant aspect of the Indian residential school system in Canada was the partnership between the government and religious organizations. The Canadian government provided the funding and legislative framework for the schools, but it was religious institutions, primarily the Catholic, Anglican, Presbyterian, and United Churches, that were responsible for the day to day operation of the schools. The government's reasoning behind this partnership was twofold. Religious organizations had the infrastructure and personnel to run the schools, and they were seen as moral authorities that could civilize Indigenous children through Christian education. Religious instruction was central to the curriculum, with the goal of converting Indigenous children to Christianity, which was considered essential to their civilization. Christian values, religious services, and moral teachings permeated the daily life at these schools, with Indigenous spiritual practices often denounced as heathen or savage. The government religious partnership also allowed the state to offload much of the responsibility for the school's operation onto the churches. Though the Canadian government retained control over key decisions, such as the mandatory attendance laws that forced Indigenous children into these institutions. Despite the government's oversight, the religious orders were largely left to run the schools as they saw fit, which led to widespread abuse. Understaffed and underfunded, many schools had poor living conditions, and children were often subjected to harsh punishments for speaking their native languages or practicing their traditional cultures. The collaboration between the government and the churches thus created a system that not only sought to assimilate Indigenous children, but also became a source of deep trauma for many Indigenous communities. The system lasted well into the 20th century, with many schools operating until the 1970s and 80s. It was not until the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, of Canada in the early 21st century that the full extent of the abuse, cultural suppression, and neglect in these schools became widely acknowledged. The TRC identified the collaboration between the government and religious organizations as central to the residential schools' destructive legacy, highlighting the role both played in the systemic attempt to erase Indigenous cultures. The experiences of Indigenous children at Indian boarding schools in the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia, as well as residential schools across North America, were marked by severe hardships and abuses. The common conditions in these schools reflected their purpose to strip away the children's cultural identity and assimilate them into Euro American and Canadian society. This was often done through a combination of harsh discipline, cultural suppression, and enforced isolation from their families. One of the most devastating aspects of the boarding and residential school experience was the widespread use of harsh discipline to control and assimilate the children. Indigenous children were subjected to strict regimens, enforced by punitive measures for any infraction. Physical abuse was rampant, with children being beaten, whipped, or subjected to other forms of corporal punishment for offenses such as speaking their native language, not conforming to European norms of behavior, or attempting to run away. Emotional abuse was equally pervasive, as children were often shamed for their Indigenous heritage and taught to despise their cultures. In many schools, the children were ridiculed or humiliated for their traditional customs, contributing to deep seated feelings of inferiority. Tragically, sexual abuse was also documented in many schools, with children being victimized by staff and clergy, who often went unpunished due to the lack of oversight and accountability in these institutions. The combination of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse left many children traumatized with lifelong psychological scars. Another central feature of the boarding school system was the forced removal of Indigenous children from their families and communities. This removal was often achieved through coercion, with parents being pressured or legally forced to send their children to these schools. Once taken, children would often remain at the school for many years, with only limited opportunities to visit their families, if any. This long period of separation from their families was particularly devastating, as the children were disconnected from the support systems and cultural teachings that were integral to their identity. Many children were taken hundreds of miles away from their homes, making it nearly impossible for parents to visit or intervene in their children's lives. Communication with family members was also heavily restricted, and in some cases, children were not allowed to write letters home. The disconnection from cultural practices was intentional, as the school sought to immerse the children fully in Euro American or Euro Canadian values and customs. This isolation from their families severed the transmission of traditional knowledge, language, and spiritual beliefs, leaving children feeling alienated from their roots. Perhaps the most profound and lasting impact of the boarding residential schools was the loss of language and cultural identity experienced by the children. At these schools, Indigenous languages were strictly forbidden. Children were often punished, sometimes severely, for speaking their native languages, which were seen as obstacles to their assimilation into settler society. The prohibition of Indigenous languages was part of a broader effort to erase Indigenous identity. By depriving children of their ability to speak their mother tongues, the schools attempted to sever their connection to their communities and cultural heritage. In place of their traditional languages and customs, the children were taught Eurocentric values, Christianity, and vocational skills. Religious instruction, often forced, aimed to convert the children to Christianity, with Indigenous spiritual practices dismissed as pagan or heathen. The school's curriculum emphasized manual labor and vocational training, preparing boys for agricultural or industrial work and girls for domestic service, reinforcing the idea that Indigenous children were to be shaped into a laboring underclass. Academic education was often secondary to these vocational goals, as the schools did not envision Indigenous children pursuing higher education or leadership roles within society. The intent was clear: to mold Indigenous children into subservient roles within the settler economy while eradicating their Indigenous identity. The cumulative effect of these policies was a generation of children who grew up estranged from their families, communities, and cultural heritage. Many survivors of the residential and boarding school system spoke of the deep sense of cultural loss and identity confusion that resulted from this systemic erasure. Even after leaving the schools, many Indigenous children struggled to reintegrate into their communities, feeling as though they no longer belonged to either the Eurocentric world of the school or their own Indigenous culture. This loss of language and identity has had intergenerational effects, as many survivors were unable to pass down their languages and cultural practices to their children and grandchildren. The side effects of this we are still seeing today. Despite the oppressive nature of the Indian boarding schools in the Pacific Northwest, British Columbia, and beyond, Indigenous people resisted and survived the attempts to erase their identities. This resistance took many forms, both overt and covert, as Indigenous children, families, and communities fought to preserve their children, language, and dignity in the face of forced assimilation. Acts of resistance were not only about survival, but about the deliberate reclamation of identity, cultural heritage, and collective rights. Within the boarding and residential schools, children often engaged in covert acts of resistance to maintain connections to their language and cultural traditions. Despite the severe punishments that could follow, many children continued to speak their Indigenous languages in secret, away from the ears of teachers and administrators. In hidden corners of the dormitories or while working in the fields, children whispered their native tongues and taught each other traditional songs and stories. These small but powerful acts of defiance allowed them to hold on to their cultural identity in an environment designed to strip it away. Additionally, students sometimes ran away from the schools, enduring harsh physical conditions and the threat of punishment to return home, if only briefly, to reconnect with their families and communities. Beyond the walls of the schools, parents and tribal leaders played a crucial role in resisting the system. Many Indigenous families fought tirelessly to have their children returned, often traveling long distances or petitioning the government to bring their children back home. In some cases, families hid their children or refused to send them to the schools, risking fines, jail time, or other penalties. Tribal leaders also advocated for the rights of their people, speaking out against the abuses of the residential school system and pushing for reforms. Although the power dynamics of the time were stacked against them, these acts of resistance helped lay the groundwork for later movements that would challenge the residential school system and its legacy. Despite the widespread trauma and cultural suppression experienced in the schools, Indigenous cultural resilience has been remarkable. Many survivors of the residential and boarding schools worked to reclaim the cultural heritage that had been denied to them. Upon leaving the schools, they sought out elders, community members, and family who still practiced traditional ways, relearning their languages, ceremonies, and customs. Survivors often took it upon themselves to become cultural carriers, passing down the knowledge they had reclaimed to younger generations. This was especially significant because, for many, the schools had been an attempt to sever the link between generations. Rebuilding this link became a central part of healing and cultural recovery. Rebuilding community and cultural practices was a critical part of this resilience. Survivors in their communities reinvigorated traditional practices that had been suppressed, from language revitalization projects to the revival of ceremonies that had been banned. Language revitalization programs have been key to cultural survival, with many communities working to teach their languages in schools, community centers, and homes. Traditional ceremonies, such as potlatches in the Pacific Northwest and powwows, which have been outlawed and suppressed, were revitalized as central aspects of community life. Indigenous people also reclaimed their rights to practice spiritual and healing traditions that had been dismissed or demonized by the churches that ran the schools. In the decades following the closure of the residential schools, survivors began to share their stories, advocating for the recognition of the harms caused by the schools and calling for justice. Their testimonies have been instrumental in the creation of truth and reconciliation processes, both in Canada and the United States, which aim to address the lasting impacts of the boarding and residential school systems. The survival and resurgence of Indigenous culture, despite concerted efforts to erase it, stand as powerful examples of resilience. Survivors have not only reclaimed their own identities, but have also ensured that future generations would have access to their cultural heritage, thereby strengthening the bonds between past, present, and future Indigenous communities. The legacy of Indian boarding schools in the United States and Canada is one of profound and lasting impact on Indigenous communities. The policies of forced assimilation, cultural erasure, and abuse have left deep scars that continue to affect generations of Indigenous peoples. This legacy is characterized by intergenerational trauma, ongoing efforts toward healing and reconciliation, and the resurgence of cultural revitalization movements. The trauma experienced by Indigenous children in boarding schools did not end when they left the institutions. Instead, the psychological effects of abuse and cultural suppression have been carried through families and passed down to subsequent generations. Survivors of these schools often experience profound emotional and mental health challenges, such as depression, anxiety, and post traumatic stress disorder. The abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual, inflicted on these children, along with the forced separation from their families and communities, led to feelings of abandonment, loss, and shame, which they carried into adulthood. Many survivors struggled to reintegrate into their communities, having been off from their cultural roots, language, and identity, leaving them feeling disconnected from both their traditional ways of life and the mainstream society that had tried to assimilate them. The trauma was not limited to those who attended the schools. Intergenerational trauma, the transmission of trauma from one generation to the next, has manifested in widespread social and health challenges in Indigenous communities. Children of boarding school survivors often grew up in households where the pain of the residential school experience was ever present, even if it was not openly discussed. This has contributed to cycles of substance abuse, mental health struggles, and violence within some Indigenous families. Additionally, the loss of cultural identity has led to feelings of alienation and low self worth for many Indigenous people, as generations were deprived of the opportunity to fully connect with their heritage. Health disparities, such as higher rates of suicide, addiction, and chronic diseases, continue to plague Indigenous communities, in part as a result of the long term effects of boarding school policies. In recent decades, significant efforts have been made to confront the painful legacy of Indian boarding schools and work toward healing and reconciliation. In Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, that was established in 2008, was a monumental step in addressing the abuses of the residential school system. The TRC collected testimonies from thousands of survivors, documented the systemic nature of the abuse, and issued 94 calls to action aimed at addressing the historical injustices and promoting healing. The TRC's report acknowledged the school's role in the cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples and called for reparations, language revitalization programs, and efforts to educate the broader public about the history of residential schools. The TRC was a critical moment in Canada's national reckoning with this dark chapter of its history, and it has inspired ongoing conversations about restitution and the implementation of the calls to action in areas such as health, education, and justice. In the United States, the conversation around boarding schools has gained momentum more recently. In 2021, the U.S. government launched the U.S. Indian Boarding School Initiative, an unprecedented federal effort to confront the boarding school legacy. Led by Secretary of the Interior, the initiative aims to identify the locations of unmarked burial sites at former boarding schools and document the full extent of the harm caused by these assimilationist policies. The initiative also seeks to publicly acknowledge the injustices suffered by Indigenous children in their communities. The discovery of mass graves at Canadian residential schools has prompted a similar sense of urgency in the United States to confront the unmarked graves and untold stories of its own boarding school system. This effort marks a critical step toward healing as Indigenous communities work to reclaim the stories of those who never returned home and seek accountability from the institutions that perpetuated the abuse. While the legacy of Indian boarding schools is painful, Indigenous communities have shown incredible strength and resilience in the face of these efforts to erase their identities. One of the most powerful responses to the boarding school legacy has been the resurgence of cultural revitalization movements across Indigenous nations. These efforts include initiatives to revitalize Indigenous languages, which are often on the brink of extinction due to the prohibition of their use in residential and boarding schools. Language revitalization programs, immersion schools, and language classes have become vital tools in reconnecting Indigenous people with their heritage. In many communities, elders and language speakers are working with younger generations to pass on their knowledge, ensuring that Indigenous languages, once suppressed, can thrive again. In addition to language revitalization, there has been a significant movement to restore traditional cultural practices and education. Indigenous communities are reclaiming ceremonies, spiritual practices, and ways of life that were lost or suppressed during the boarding school era. Many Indigenous leaders and boarding school survivors have become advocates for culturally responsive education, developing Indigenous led schools and programs that reflect their communities' values, traditions, and histories. These initiatives aim not only to preserve Indigenous culture, but to ensure that future generations grow up with a strong sense of identity and pride in their heritage. Survivors of the boarding school system have played a crucial role in these cultural revival efforts, often leading the charge to confront the abuses of the past while creating spaces for healing and renewal. Advocacy from survivors has been instrumental in bringing attention to the enduring effects of the boarding schools, pushing for reparations and ensuring that future generations do not suffer the same erasure of culture and identity. Their resilience has transformed the painful legacy of the schools into a source of strength for many communities, as they use their stories to educate others and inspire change. Through these efforts, Indigenous peoples are not only healing from the traumas of the past, but also reclaiming their future, rooted in the revitalization of their rich cultural traditions. The legacy of Indian boarding schools in the United States and the residential schools in Canada is one of profound historical injustice. These institutions were not just educational facilities, they were tools of cultural genocide aimed at eradicating Indigenous identities by forcibly assimilating children into Eurocentric values. The trauma inflicted upon generations of Indigenous children through physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, the suppression of languages, and the severance of family ties left scars that persist to this day. Governments in both countries have begun to acknowledge the deep harm caused by these schools, recognizing that they contributed to the systemic destruction of Indigenous cultures, languages, and social structures. This recognition has been a long time coming, and it is a necessary first step toward addressing the lasting damages of colonial policies. Thank you for taking the time to join me as we explored another aspect of not just Pacific Northwest history, but North American history. If you have stories of your own to share, follow me on social media at ParaNWPod and message or comment on a post. Until next time, bye.